That takes us to our first panel of the day. So I'd like to invite Tom, Egan, Dr. Paul Dean, MaREI Donnelly, and Rowena Dwyer to join us, please, on the stage. Okay, so as Luke said before he finished his presentation, if there are questions for Luke, or indeed for any of our panelists and our comments on the day, feel free to put them into the Slido app, hashtag 4052835. So I'm delighted to welcome our panel on stage. So just to introduce our panel, so I start with Tom. Tom Egan is board member of Móna Renewable Energy Team with special responsibility for Móna's renewable power generation assets. Tom was instrumental in heading up leading the transition of Eden Dairy Power to 100% renewable generation and developing the biomass supply chain. Tom has over 30 years experience in the global electricity sector and senior management positions with Móna and a range of other organisations prior to joining Móna. Our next speaker in order on the stage is Rowena Dwyer. Rowena is the Sustainable and Climate Lead at Enterprise Ireland. Before joining Enterprise Ireland, Rowena was the Chief Economist of the Irish Farmers Association, and prior to joining the IFA, Rowena worked as a consultant at PwC in Dublin. Thanks, Rowena, for joining us. Next, we have MaREI Donnelly. We're delighted that MaREI Donnelly can join us this morning as Chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council. MaREI has spent 30 years with the European Commission, was Director for Renewables, Energy Efficiency and Innovation. MaREI collaborates with MaREI in Cork and UCD and other institutes. Previously, she was the Chairperson of Renewable Energy Ireland, the first Chairperson of Renewable Energy Ireland, and was a non-executive Director of Tipperary Energy Agency. And our fourth panellist is Dr. Paul Dean. Paul is a Senior Research Fellow in Energy and Climate Policy with Science Foundation Ireland at the funded MaREI Centre in University College Cork. So Paul was one of the senior writers on the IrBEA report, Transport in Ireland, a Pathway to Halving Emissions, meeting ambitious reduction targets in the transport sector and the role of sustainable bioenergy. So I welcome all of our panellists this morning, and thanks very much for taking time out of your schedule to join us. So if I could start with you, Tom. I think John has very clearly articulated the diverse portfolio of projects in the renewable energy space. Included in this is obviously Eden Dairy Power, and the various biogas projects that you're talking about. Can you give us an outline of the opportunities that you see for bioenergy and the role of Móna in the low carbon transition?
Well, certainly we're all aware of the shortage of supply on the system at the minute. So Eden Dairy Power plays a key role in that in a couple of ways. In the first way, it provides security of supply through mainly indigenous biomass material. It provides carbon neutral electricity to the system. But in addition to that, it provides system services on the system, flexibility that the plant has, the inertia that the plant has, that allows more intermittent renewables to be added to the system. So it has a significant contribution to play in the current environment.
Thanks, Tom. And just following on from that point, you're moving from co-firing to 100% biomass with permission received up to 2030. You're using residual biomass and providing a route to market for this type of material, which mightn't necessarily otherwise have a route to market. Can you outline the opportunities and challenges associated with this, and how this transition, and what opportunities and challenges it will present to the supply chain and also others involved?
Well, clearly the opportunity for suppliers in Ireland is to meet the demand that we have. Like John said earlier, we have a current demand of about 500,000 tonnes of material. That will grow to 1 million tonnes between now and 2030. But what we're trying to do is do that in tandem with the available material that's coming from the indigenous industry. And we want to work in partnership with the various suppliers, because the material we have essentially has no other commercial value. It's somewhere between compost and a fuel. And the technology we have in Eden Dairy is capable of handling that type of material. It's very, very similar to peat. So I suppose what we're presenting is an opportunity to capture all of that available material that's out there, material that's traditionally left behind on the forest floor, and residual material that comes from ex-sawmills. So there are opportunities for growers, for foresters, for sawmills, and for everybody to contribute to reducing the carbon intensity of the complete electricity system.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And we'll talk in further detail later to Joseph about the actual various different streams of that material and the uses, how it can be utilised. In line with our conference theme, we're talking about today reducing cost, carbon and supply risk. So as a generator of dispatchable renewable electricity, can you just outline how Bord na Móna is contributing to this and how we need to value this dispatchable element of electricity generation?
Well, as I said, in the first instance, we are a dispatchable plant. We're very flexible. The unit can operate between 120 megawatts and 40 megawatts. So we flex depending on whether available renewable technologies are on the system. We provide inertia on the system, facilitating new or more renewables in the form of wind and solar to be put on there. In addition to that, we're I suppose, creating security of supply in that 80% of the material, the biomass material we're using is indigenous material. But most of all, it's the carbon reduction. Between now and 2030, we're going to essentially displace about 3 million tonnes of carbon in the Irish electricity system. Because if Eden Dairy Power is not there, the services that we provide and the power that we produce has to be supplied by some other thermal plant. So it's a key contributor to both sustainability and carbon reduction in line with the theme of the conference.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I'll come back to you in a minute. We'll move on to Rowena. Rowena, while Tom is in the generation space, you're the opposite end in that you're working with businesses who require energy, and security of supply, cost and carbon are key considerations for your businesses which you work with. Can you outline your own role in Enterprise Ireland and your work in sustainability and climate?
Absolutely. Thanks a million, Seán, for inviting me here today. And so I guess just to give that small bit of background in terms of where we are in Enterprise Ireland on this agenda. Our most recent strategy that we launched earlier this year highlighted for the first time a key pillar of enterprise development as actually being around sustainability and climate. It was the first time it really reflected as well, I suppose, the whole of economy realisation that all sectors of the economy have to decarbonise and have got really challenging targets by 2030, and enterprise is one of them. They've got a target to reduce their emissions by 35% by 2030. So as an enterprise development agency, you're then saying, well, okay, well, what does that mean for our companies? So there's two sides to what my team are doing, and I suppose what the organisation is actually moving towards in this area. One is sustainability transformation. So this is actually working with our companies to look at their own sustainability options, and I know we'll talk about this in a minute, and what investments they need to make, what plans they need to put in place to decarbonise. And then on the other side, there's what Enterprise Ireland actually does for its everyday living, which is supporting Irish enterprises to actually grow, to realise new market opportunities and to capitalise on those, particularly with a focus on overseas markets. So I suppose we're looking and we're working with companies on the sustainability or the low carbon transition from both aspects. All companies, what do they need to do to transform their sustainability performance? And then companies who actually have technologies and solutions in this area, can we grow them? Can we make them stronger, better, and better able to realise the opportunities that will be there?
Just following on from that, a number of months ago, I know we discussed the context and the requirements for enterprise to decarbonise, and we discussed the types of technologies that companies are looking at investing in, including bioenergy. But can you elaborate on this and provide feedback on what companies are actually, what renewable energy technologies are they deploying, what the technology options they're considering, and what is the driver? Is it investment, is it carbon, is it cost, is it supply risk of that customer demand?
Yeah, I think, Seán, it's a great question. What drives companies and what are they looking at? I guess one thing that probably everyone here in the room would be aware of who's involved in this space, but definitely, enterprise is still in some ways and some sectors particularly at quite an early stage in its development of the thought process here. There are some sectors that are definitely much further in their thinking, and I would say the food sector much further down the road of developing plans and making investments. And so what are they looking at? They're looking at I guess those who are thinking long term, they're looking at all types of technologies that would support their decarbonisation. So that would include, obviously, looking, depending on their industrial processes, direct electrification. It would also, and just speaking to this, they are already deploying biomass technology, and they're also most certainly looking at anaerobic digestion as an option for investment into the future, particularly if you think about and it has been alluded to earlier, heat processes where high temperature heat, where you're going to be replacing, I guess what do companies need to do? What they're looking at is replacing existing technologies that are fueled by fossil fuels, like high temperature heating processes. They have to be replaced by something that will do the job as effectively. And so the reality of the matter is, for companies, they've got to think about what are their investment needs, what will they need to be able to continue their industrial production the way that they intend to, and then what are the best renewable energy technologies. So one thing I would say to do that, one thing I would say is, in terms of just bringing it back to Enterprise Ireland briefly for a second, one of the main areas of support that we're focused on at the moment is actually supporting companies to make plans, to actually get really good advice as to what their processes are at the moment, and then what are the investment decisions they can make, and following that, what are the supports that are available to incentivise them or to bridge the gap between thinking about making that investment and making it.
And speaking about support, how can Enterprise Ireland help the bioenergy fuel producers that are here today and other people active and members active in the bioenergy space to maximise the growth opportunities that exist and will develop here, both here and overseas? So how can our IrBEA members assist your clients on this decarbonisation journey?
Yeah, it is a great question, Seán, because actually, like I said at the very start, what we're realising more and more is the fact that the low carbon transition is a challenge on the one hand and an opportunity on the other. So what we're doing with companies who actually are part of Enterprise Ireland, we have companies who are already working in this space. We have biomass boiler manufacturers. I know one of our companies is speaking later, which I'm delighted to see, and others who are investing in or creating or manufacturing other renewable technologies. We also are supporting companies. So we work directly with those companies on a one-to-one basis, whether it's in R&D, employment support, capital support, and our overseas markets, to actually, I suppose, make them stronger and better able to realise the opportunities that will continue to grow. In addition to that, I think research and development, and it came up already in the presentations, there has to be, and I know this will be spoken about by other panel members shortly, there has to be a continued focus on supporting enterprise and supporting the research institutions to actually develop more sophisticated technologies that can actually eventually commercialise into solutions for companies. And then finally, just at a very practical level, and you made me think about this while I was preparing for this conference. We, of course, have a role in Enterprise Ireland in actually bringing our companies together, as those who have the demand and those who actually have the solutions. We do it already in certain areas. We have what's called a global sourcing initiative, where we bring together our multinationals, our suppliers, and those who want those solutions. And we certainly have a greater role to play in that in this particular area, because we have companies with the solutions, and we have companies who certainly need those solutions.
Just to put you on the spot, Rowena, just one question into a Slido. What are the limiting factors for business adopting bioenergy technologies? Is that capital, fuel supply, or knowledge, or is it a mixture of all?
Yeah.
If you had to pick one of them, or is it all?
I think it is probably it probably is all or elements of all. So absolutely, and I see, and I know my colleagues in SEAI will be speaking later, and I think it's to talk about the supports that are available. There is that whole gap between the cost of investment, the return on investment, and that is certainly limiting companies from maybe taking that step. So providing funding support is critically important to actually bridging that gap. But the other thing I would say is capability is a huge piece as well. Companies' understanding of what is out there needs to, their awareness and their capability, strengthening that. And I'll go back again to just speak briefly about, one of the things that we introduced in Enterprise Ireland this year, our Green Transition Fund, has significant grant aid support for companies to actually develop plans, investment plans, and actually start at the very start, establish where they are, what's their carbon footprint, and then develop a roadmap for investment, because they won't all do it in one go. So I would say awareness and capability, and then bridging the funding gap. They'll be the things that will assist.
Okay, thanks very much, Rowena. Just moving to MaREI, you have a different role again to the previous two panellists. So can you outline the role of the Climate Change Advisory Council and what his role will be in the future? Because there are many people out there that know of the body but probably don't fully understand its role. So as chairperson, would you be able to give us just a brief outline of what your role is?
Thanks very much indeed, Seán, and indeed I had to do this myself when I started with the council. I think if I could maybe just start by explaining what's the structure now in Ireland, because Ireland signed the Paris Agreement in 2015 and came back and said, okay, we've signed this, we're going to have to take it seriously, we're going to have to do something about it. And like any chief executive running a business, if you want to achieve something with your business, you say, okay, I'm the chief executive, we're going to, with the board of directors, we're going to decide this is what we want to achieve. So Ireland Inc. adopted legislation and said, this is what we want to achieve. We want to achieve net zero by 2050, and we're going to get 51% reduction by 2030, and we put it into legislation. That was the Climate Action Act. So that was the chief executive saying, this is what we want to achieve. And like any chief executive, you have to make it clear. Then you say, okay, we need to establish timelines and milestones if we're going to achieve this, like running a business. And this is really where the sub-elements of the 2030 target, 51% reduction comes in, and making it proximate through what we call the 5-year carbon budgets. So it's like, running a project, you have to have the steps, whatever. You need to identify the actions, and this clearly is where the sectoral ceiling comes in, because there will be actions in industry, there will be actions in agriculture, in the buildings or whatever. This is where the sectoral ceiling comes in. So you can see how the project management process is rolling itself out. You then have specific measures, and this is where we have the Climate Action Plan. And this is what hopefully we will be, an annual cycle where the government publishes quite clearly what are the measures that are being taken, what are the policy shifts, what are the new policies, what are their supports happening in each of the sectors each year in order to achieve the objectives. And then, of course, you have to have a measure and evaluate process. So where does the Climate Council comes in? Firstly, we're tasked with proposing the 5-year budgets, and that's a process that we'll continue. They were adopted by the Oireachtas earlier this year, so we have a 5-year budget up to 25, then to 30, to 35, and it will roll out, because, as I say, this makes it much more proximate in terms of reality. And we have a role in terms of providing independent, evidence-based advice to government. This would be part and parcel of the monitoring and evaluation process. We make recommendations, we give advice, we monitor what's happening, and yes, on occasions, we will criticise and comment. So that's our role as part of, so I try to put it in a business perspective, because this is what the audience really is here. But in fact, Ireland Inc. has taken a business approach to what it's going to do in the climate area, and that's where the Climate Council fits in. So we give advice at the beginning, and we monitor and evaluate, are we on track?
Okay, and just, you mentioned about the sector emission ceilings that have been agreed by government. Can you put in perspective the scale of the challenge? We heard John this morning outline the scale of the challenge in the electricity sector, but can you outline it across the sectors very briefly, and also the challenge, but also the opportunity to achieve these targets which are in place and being set?
Well, the sectoral targets that were eventually decided on this summer, and I suppose we all saw the media coverage of the discussions that were taking place, it was the allocation of the carbon budgets over the sectors for the first carbon budget period and the second carbon budget period. I can have to say that officially the Climate Change Advisory Council did point out that they were not really sectoral ceilings because they don't actually achieve the 51% reduction. We're only achieving about 43% on the basis of the targets that have been set. And shall we say the warning that comes with that is that the numbers that were set already will have to change, will have to increase, because we will not be able to get our 51% reduction without it. All of the targets that were set are challenging. I know there was a lot of media coverage about the target for agriculture, which ended up at 25%. But you know, when you're looking at an 80% reduction in the electricity space, this is frighteningly difficult to achieve. You're looking at 45, 50% in the residential space, in the transport space, in the industrial space. Even these numbers might sound less than 80%, but they are challenging. Every single target is challenging. So in many ways, we have set ourselves a really difficult job here. But we have no choice. You know, if you're drowning, you don't say, well, we might go for the life buoy. You say, we're going to go for the life buoy because there is no other alternative. And that's where we're at the moment. But what it does mean, and I would just go back to confirm what Rowena was saying, what it does mean is we have a black box of about 5 million tonnes. We will need innovation. We will need technological development in order to complete that gap that we have. A rollout of new ideas, new innovations, new ways of doing things, some of which we think we might have, you know, they're within touching distance, but we will definitively need those. And that means that we will have different processes in the way we do business, in the way we live our lives, and in the way society is structured. And part of that will present real opportunities, both for business and for society. And I think our challenge is, let's make the most of those opportunities.
And speaking of those opportunities, where do you see bioenergy fitting then within that renewable energy technology mix? What sectors, what uses? Luke gave his perspective earlier, but it'd be interesting hearing your perspective.
Well, I mean, clearly bioenergy, today it's about 50% of the renewable energy in Europe. And Ireland is particularly well placed in terms of bioenergy. You know, we're an agricultural nation. We know how to use the land, how to work the land, and how to get the benefit from it. Our challenge really is to maximize the benefit of the resource that we can produce. So we have a challenge, we need to produce it. And I think that's an area that we need to think about more. We're talking about diversification in the agricultural space away from, for example, the number of cattle that we have in our national herd into alternative income-generating activities for farmers. Bioenergy is one. We need to maximize that. We need to get that rolled out as efficiently as possible. When we produce it, then we have to be as efficient as possible in terms of how we're actually going to apply it. And in one way, the challenge for bioenergy is to decide where it's going to be used. You know, all of the sectors want you. You know, for heat, you're invaluable because you can achieve the high temperatures that Rowena was talking about in terms of industrial demand. For transport, we don't have a lot of alternatives at the moment. So transport needs bioenergy sources. And as John said, electricity will need a dispatchable source of electricity to put with the variable renewable energy sources that we also have. So part of your challenge is which of these opportunities will be availed of and will give you the best return in the economy and, frankly, in your own pocket. So for me, I see a very bright future. I would raise one comment, though, and I think it's really something to think about. The government has already announced the idea of producing a land use strategy. They're in consultation, they're taking contributions for it now. This is pivotal to this industry. It's absolutely pivotal what the land use strategy is, what it says, and how it fits. So I would very strongly say this is one of your top priorities. You need to think about this, you need to contribute to this, you need to be very active as part of the process of developing the land use strategy, because that's going to underpin bioenergy going forward, not just this decade, but into decades to come.
And just one concluding question, MaREI, for you for this round. We've had a lot of talk over the summer on biomethane, and there was a lot of disappointment in post-budget that there was no real announcements, for want of a better word, but we do hear of a revised target, 5.7 terawatt hours. How do you see this being mobilised? And again, similar to the last question, are there particular sectors where you see this being more advantageous for use than others? So how do we mobilise the biomethane resource?
So I think the first issue is, to some extent, walking in today, I met some people and I was saying this is a little bit like 5 years ago walking into a wind industry conference. The wind industry had gone through a very lull period without any wind and without any policy, and it was, had almost come to stasis. And then the policy started to come through, the direction of travel became clear, industry could see, yes, we have targets, we have policies, we have support, yes, we can now go and invest, and it's a very vibrant industry again, and it is expanding. Bioenergy has moved into centre stage in terms of the policy. So I think that's the first very important message to say. I mean, it has moved out of the sidelines into centre stage. You now have ministers for agriculture, minister for energy, talking about bioenergy. So it has arrived, shall we say. The supports are also starting to come in terms of capital grant supports, in terms of investment support through people like ISEF, and in terms of market pull measures through the renewable heat obligation. So we are at the start of what I would see as a very vibrant opportunity for biogas, anaerobic digestion being developed in the country. The key areas are, and this is something that we could talk about for a long time, we have some areas that are really, really hard to decarbonise. And biogas is a very valuable commodity. So I think the challenge we will have is to match, a scarce, important resource with a hard to decarbonise demand area and put them together to the maximum benefit. And Rowena has already mentioned, high temperatures in industry. It's clearly one that we need to think about how we can support that. We will have to think about transport because of the limited alternatives that are there. And we need to think about things, for example, maybe biogas and biomass in terms of support of district heating, which a bit like anaerobic digestion has now also moved centre stage thanks to the heat study done by SEAI and the appreciation and realisation that we can heat our buildings, 50% of our buildings, through district heating systems. So there is a role there as well.
Okay. Paul, to bring you in, can I ask you the same question and to follow on, what do you see as the bioenergy opportunity? Where does it fit in your perspective within the renewable energy mix? Similar question to our other. Yeah,
sure. Look, echoing, I suppose, what Luke said and what the panelists said, look, you need everything, and I suppose just reflecting on the year, just listen to the panelists speak there, and MaREI, you're right. It's been a kind of a year of, what's that phrase, was the best of times, the worst of times. In 2021, we ushered in our new climate legislation, which was really important. The carbon budgets are fundamentally important because they reflect the climate science. It's a cumulative build-up of emissions in our atmosphere that's damaging our planet. It's a bit like smoking, it's the cumulative build-up of smoking that damages your lungs. Telling your doctor that you're going to stop smoking in 2050 or 2050, she'll say that's fine, but it's the damage you're doing till then. So that was really good. We were really proud of that. And then we've kind of done nothing since. We've done a lot of talking, we've done a lot of strategies, we've done a lot of reviews, a lot of consultations. John has listened to you this morning, and we've done a similar piece of analysis in UCC, looking at all our emissions across society. And MaREI, you mentioned the carbon budgets. The first carbon budget will finish in December 2025. So between January 2021 and December 2025, us as an economy, as families, farmers, communities, firms, can only emit about 295 million tonnes, let's say units, 195 million units into the atmosphere. We're 18 months into that now, more or less. We're 18 months in, so we're 30% into our budget, and we've already blown about 40% of it. That's very worrying. We're going to miss our targets. We're going to miss the first target. The thing that we tell the world that we're good at, we're green, we're clean, come here. We're going to miss our first target. All the emissions are going in the wrong direction. John, you mentioned the power sector. The power sector can emit only 40 million tonnes between January 2021 and December 2025. Last year we emitted 10 million tonnes. This year we're going to be about 11 and a half. We're going the wrong way. Transport emissions are up 13% on last year. Now, last year was a COVID year, but we're flatlining around 2018. Agriculture are flatlining. And what I'm worried about, a couple of things. Well, there's lots of things I'm worried about, Seán. The main thing, the environment issue is damaging, but the credibility issue, what are the public going to think of this from a credibility issue? This stuff is going to become a joke, a running joke if we don't hit these targets. We'll lose credibility with the public and in industry. We're so fortunate in Ireland to have lots of corporates, lots of companies, lots of co-ops. Many of those people now have net zero targets for 2030. They have way higher ambition. They don't want to be in a country that is one of the highest polluters of greenhouse gas on a per person basis in Europe. So there's a reputational risk of missing these targets, there's an environmental risk, and there's a social risk, And we do need bioenergy, Seán, in terms of transport, in terms of heating, in terms of agriculture. You have rural families crying out there looking for different ways to use their land. And it's not about technology. I spoke to Charlie there before he came up, anaerobic digesters in the UK. Spoke to James. Liquid sustainable biofuels in other countries. It's not about the technology. It's not about the science. It's not about that we don't know what to do. It's just there's a lack of taking ownership and taking decisions. There's a kind of a pass the parcel mentality in terms of taking responsibility. We need to act, and we're not acting, and the consequences will be.
And if I could just take you back, Paul, to your colleague Brian O'Gallagher at our 2020 conference, outlined very strongly that there was an energy transition blind spot towards bioenergy. Do you think that has changed over the last 2 years? And if that hasn't changed, what's the reason for that blind spot?
The visibility is improving, but it's still there. Anytime we hear on the media and we talk about the current energy crisis and we talk about the current climate targets and we talk about the near-term issues, we always get swept up in this optimism for the future. And that's fine. Hydrogen, offshore wind, floating stuff, we need all that. But we have to be honest with people as well. It's a decade away, at least. The problem is now. The problem is not the future. So and part of that, Seán, stems that I suppose we have. In part, an ideological preference towards electrifying everything, which is beautiful. It's simple. It's coherent. But the evidence isn't there to support it. You can't electrify everything. You can't put a plug on everything. There's no evidence to show that. We do need bioenergy, and often when you believe a future and you believe this ideology that lacks evidence, you tend to take options off the table, and that's what was happening. We thought we could electrify everything, we could do everything with renewables. Renewables are fundamentally important, but they can't do everything. You need some of the heavy lifting, and that's where bioenergy comes in as well.
Just a query or a question on the transport sector, because it probably hasn't been delved into in as great a detail as some of the other sectors here, but you authored a report, Transport in Ireland, a pathway to have emissions. For information, there's copies on our stand out there. It's an excellent report, and thanks for your work on that. But within that, we see that Ireland has tens of thousands of what we would say invisible electric cars in the form of liquid biofuels at pumps, fuel pumps displacing fossil fuels in transport and avoiding 500,000 tonnes of CO2 in 2020. So this is similar to, I think, 250,000 EVs on the road. Can you outline, I suppose, the contribution that liquid biofuels can make, but also around the targets in transport and the opportunities that exist in the broader bioenergy space for transport?
And this is the incredible thing about bioenergy, and MaREI, you mentioned about how it kind of gets into different areas. Those invisible cars, but the policy is invisible as well. Very few people outside of this room know that when you go to fill up your car down in Texaco or whatever the petrol station is, you're putting in biodiesel, you're putting in bioethanol, and it works. Nobody cares. People just want to sit into a car to go from A to B and they get around. It's reduced our emissions by 700,000 tonnes this year. That's significant, And liquid biofuels are fundamentally important to meeting those transport targets, along with everything else. We need massive deployment of EVs. But look, we've got 10 million tonnes of emissions in transport. A million EVs would take 2 million tonnes of emissions. Sustainable biofuels will probably take another 2 million tonnes. So it's fundamentally important that we deploy that. But the key for you as an industry is that word there, sustainability, right? We're only going to get one shot at this. Biofuels gets a greater level of scrutiny than things like EVs and solar panels, and we all know that. Sustainability is fundamental. We have to get it right. If we lose the public on this, we saw the disaster with the palm oil stuff down in Malaysia. We have to get it right from day one. We're only getting one shot at this, and that's why the technology is there, the policy is there, but the foundation, everything must be built on is sustainability, and that's up to you as an industry to make sure we deliver on that.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Just go back to Tom very briefly, and this is a straightforward question, Tom. from Slido, will Bord na Móna go further and put all their trucks drawing biomass on biomethane? I suppose that might be something you'd aspire to, would it, Tom?
It's something we'd aspire to. We're looking at this all the time, and I think it was identified earlier. The challenge with that is we outsource all of our transportation, but what we'd love to do is work with some of our major suppliers to transition their fleet away from diesel to compressed natural gas, or ultimately hydrogen. I think where we see this ultimately going is that there's a transition happening at the minute, and we want to see that transition. And I think there are steps along the way. I think it'll be CNG first and then ultimately hydrogen. But certainly, we've just submitted a planning application to put in a hydrolyzer at one of our wind farms. We'd love to see a scenario where trucks were coming to Edenderry to supply biomass as a transition fuel until new better technologies are developed, and we see it clearly as a transition between now and 2035, that they would come and that they would refuel with hydrogen at Edenderry. We'd love to see that happening.
Okay, and just to follow on, Tom, an attendee here is asking about the prioritisation of the use of biomass and potentially high efficiency uses such as heating. But I think there might be confusion. You're targeting a different type of resource potentially that would be used in maybe your SSRH boiler application that needs a different type of biomass. So maybe just outline how there's a place for Bord na Móna as an energy generator, but also for biomass to be used in conventional biomass systems, heating systems. Can you just maybe outline the fit there? Because it's just triggered a question from one of our attendees.
I suppose generally as a rule of thumb, the smaller the device, the more sensitive it is to the quality of the fuel. Like we can take fuel from 8% moisture to 70% moisture, and we're targeting the fuel that doesn't have to be processed. Whereas when you get into the smaller biomass heating devices, ideally you'd like to run them on wood pellets or a really good quality wood chip. Now the ex-sawmill material we get is 55–60% moisture. That would need to be dried down and processed to get it into a form that can be used in these heating systems. So, like I said before, we see Edenderry as a transition. We've created the supply chain. We started in 2008. I'm glad that MaREI had said that biomass is now becoming centre stage, because we were almost embarrassed to talk about biomass for a long time because it had a very negative connotation. We see ourselves as transitioning, creating the supply chain while other technologies develop to displace what we have there. But we're here now. Like, we have a short-term problem, we have a security of supply problem, we have an energy scarcity problem, and we have a carbon problem. And what we're doing fixes all of those problems with a technology and a plant that's existing.
We have a number of other questions in. We'll hopefully get to them later in the day. There's one specifically for you, MaREI. It's on the RHO, but we'll leave that to the department because we'll have a discussion on that on our panel later about the update and where that's at. So there's also a question about the Green Party is anti-flame. We'll leave that for maybe a future panel. And there's a question about fugitive emissions, but again, unfortunately, we just don't have the time to go into that here now. So I'd like to thank our panel. Thanks to Tom, Rowena, MaREI and Paul for joining us.